March 15, 1945, Camp Edison, Oklahoma. Private Eugene Patterson stood outside the women's barracks holding a box of double bubble gum, watching as 53 German prisoners filed into the mess hall for their midday meal. He had no idea that this simple gesture, this small package of colorful wrapped squares, would become the turning point in one of the most unusual prisoner of war stories in American military history. But before we discover how a misunderstanding about candy changed everything, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The moment happened during a routine distribution of Red Cross packages. Gene, a 21-year-old farm boy from Tulsa County, had been assigned to Camp Edison for 8 months. He had watched these German women arrive the previous November, had seen them maintain their rigid military bearing even in defeat, had noticed how they kept themselves separate from their American captors with walls of silence and suspicious glances. But something about their youth, their obvious homesickness, reminded him of his own sisters back home. On this particular afternoon, Gene had received a care package from his mother containing several packs of Double Bubble, the brightly colored gum that had become popular among American troops. The twisted wax paper wrappers in pink, yellow, and blue looked almost festive, like tiny presents. Without thinking too deeply about it, he decided to share some with the German women during their meal distribution. Christa Lindemann was the first to receive a piece. The 23-year-old former intelligence clerk from Dusseldorf looked down at the colorful wrapped square with confusion. She turned it over in her hands, examining the bright paper and the words she couldn't quite understand. "Double Bubble," Gene said with a friendly smile, making an exaggerated chewing motion with his jaw. Christa nodded politely, but still looked puzzled. She had never seen anything like this before. When Gene moved down the line, offering pieces to other women, Ingeborg Richter leaned over to Christa and whispered in German, "What is it? Some kind of American candy?" Christa shrugged, carefully unwrapping the pink square. It was soft, slightly sticky, and had a sweet smell. Around them, other women were doing the same, examining these strange gifts with a mixture of curiosity and caution. What happened next would be retold in Camp Edison for months to come. Edeltraud Lang, the youngest prisoner at 19 years old, popped the entire piece into her mouth and bit down hard, expecting it to dissolve like a peppermint or chocolate. Instead, her teeth sank into something rubbery and strange. Her eyes widened in surprise and mild disgust. She tried to swallow it, but it wouldn't go down. Panic flashed across her young face. Across the mess hall, Gene noticed the commotion and suddenly realized what was happening. These women had no idea what chewing gum was. They thought he had given them candy to eat and swallow. November 7, 1944. The transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Edison just as the Oklahoma sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside the covered vehicles, 53 German women sat in tense silence, their faces reflecting exhaustion, uncertainty, and the peculiar shame of defeat. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final chaotic months of the war in France and Belgium. Now, after weeks of processing and transport across the Atlantic, they found themselves in a place as foreign to them as the moon itself. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood at attention as the trucks came to a halt in the center of the compound. She was one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee this unprecedented facility. The United States military had experience managing thousands of male prisoners of war, but housing captured enemy women presented unique challenges that no manual had adequately prepared them for. She watched as the rear gates of the trucks opened and the prisoners began to descend, one by one, into their new reality. The women who emerged wore remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia they had once worn with conviction. Their ages ranged from 18 to 35, though most appeared to be in their early 20s. Despite the long journey and obvious fatigue, they maintained remarkable composure, standing straighter than many of Sullivan's own soldiers, their eyes fixed forward with practiced military discipline. Among them was Christa Lindemann, a 23-year-old intelligence clerk from Dusseldorf. She clutched a small leather satchel that contained everything she still owned in the world: a change of undergarments, a photograph of her family taken before the war, and a worn copy of Goethe's poetry that her father had given her on her 16th birthday. She had joined the auxiliary service in 1942, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. Now, standing in an American prison camp thousands of miles from home, that certainty had dissolved into something far more complicated. Beside her stood Ingeborg Richter, a 21-year-old nurse's aide from Hanover, whose delicate features and blonde hair seemed almost incongruous with her military posture. Inga had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals, had seen the brutality of war up close, and had developed a protective hardness that now served as armor against the uncertainty of captivity. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to show any weakness before their captors. Captain Sullivan began her welcoming address in clear, measured English. A translator, an older German-speaking sergeant from Pennsylvania, repeated her words in German. The rules were straightforward: obey camp regulations, cooperate with staff, maintain cleanliness and order. In return, they would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They would receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They would be allowed to write letters home, though all correspondence would be censored. They would not be mistreated. The women listened without visible reaction, their faces masks of careful neutrality. They had been taught that Americans were ruthless enemies, that capture meant degradation and cruelty. The first 3 weeks at Camp Edison passed in a fog of careful routine and deliberate distance. The German women moved through their days like ghosts, present in body but absent in spirit. They woke at dawn, made their bunks with military precision, ate their meals in silence, and spent their afternoons in the recreation yard, sitting apart from the American guards who watched over them. They spoke only to each other, and only in hushed German that carried an edge of defiance. Captain Sullivan observed this wall of separation with growing concern. She had expected some initial resistance, some period of adjustment, but the absolute refusal of these women to engage with their captors went beyond normal prisoner behavior. It was as if they had collectively decided that maintaining their dignity required complete isolation from anything American. During meals, they sat at tables furthest from the serving line, accepting their food with minimal eye contact and no words beyond the necessary. During recreation time, they formed tight clusters, their backs literally turned to the guards. Christa had emerged as an unofficial leader among the prisoners, though she held no formal rank. Her intelligence work had required her to understand chain of command and strategic thinking, and she now applied those skills to managing life in captivity. She organized the women into work groups, established unspoken rules about interaction with their captors, and served as the voice of the group when communication became absolutely necessary. Her message was consistent: maintain distance, show no weakness, wait for repatriation. The Americans, for their part, seemed confused by this impenetrable reserve. Private Eugene Patterson, assigned to guard duty in the recreation yard, found himself awkwardly trying to make small gestures of normalcy. He would nod good morning to the prisoners, only to receive blank stares in return. He once tried to help Adelheid Kaufmann, a 28-year-old administrative specialist, when she dropped a book, only to have her recoil from his outstretched hand as if he carried some contagion. The rejection stung more than he expected. Sergeant Frank Yamamoto understood their wariness better than most. As a Japanese-American who had grown up facing suspicion and prejudice, who had watched his own relatives sent to internment camps while he fought for his country, he recognized the defensive posture of people who felt they could trust no one. He didn't push for connection, but he made sure his interactions were scrupulously fair and respectful. He enforced rules consistently, distributed supplies equitably, and never raised his voice in anger. He knew that trust, if it came at all, would have to be earned slowly. The evenings were the hardest time. As darkness fell over the Oklahoma plains, the women would gather in their barracks and sing German folk songs in voices that carried both defiance and homesickness. The melodies drifted across the compound, beautiful and melancholy, a reminder that these prisoners were also daughters, sisters, and young women far from everything they had known. Late November brought an early cold snap to Oklahoma, and with it came the first cracks in the wall between captors and captives. The temperature dropped suddenly overnight, catching everyone unprepared. The barracks heating system, designed for moderate Oklahoma winters, struggled against the unexpected freeze. By morning, the women's quarters felt like an icebox, their breath visible in the frigid air as they dressed for morning roll call. Private Eugene Patterson noticed immediately during breakfast distribution that several of the German women were shivering despite wearing every layer of clothing they possessed. One in particular caught his attention, Edeltraud Lang, the youngest prisoner at 19, who had developed a persistent cough over the previous week. Now she sat hunched over her tray, her thin frame trembling with cold, her face flushed with what looked like the beginning of fever. Jean had 3 younger sisters back home in Tulsa County, and the sight of this sick girl trying to maintain her dignity while clearly suffering triggered something protective in him. Without asking permission from his superiors, Jean went to the supply depot during his lunch break. He signed out 2 extra wool blankets, a thermos of hot tea that the cook helped him prepare with honey and lemon, and returned to the barracks. He found Trode lying on her bunk, still shivering, her eyes closed in exhaustion. The other women watched with suspicious alertness as he approached, their bodies tensing as if preparing to defend their youngest member. Jean set the blankets down at the foot of the bunk and placed the thermos on the small table nearby. He made no sudden movements, spoke no words, simply performed these small acts of care and stepped back. Trode opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression of complete bewilderment. She had been taught that American soldiers were barbaric, that they showed no mercy to their enemies. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her own brother Hans, bringing her comfort without being asked. Krista stood and approached Jean, her posture still defensive, but her eyes questioning. She spoke in halting English that she had learned in school years before. "Why you do this?" Her voice carried genuine confusion rather than gratitude. Jean shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "She's sick," he said simply, as if this explained everything. "My mama always said hot tea and warm blankets are the best medicine for a cold." He paused, then added, "And she's just a kid. War or no war, nobody should suffer when they don't have to." The simplicity of his reasoning seemed to surprise Krista more than the gesture itself. She translated his words for the other women, and Jean noticed something shift in their expressions. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first small seed of doubt about their assumptions. Trode reached for the thermos with trembling hands and took a careful sip of the tea. Thanksgiving arrived at Camp Edison with a flurry of activity that left the German prisoners both confused and quietly amazed. The American staff spent 2 days preparing for what they called a holiday feast, transforming the mess hall with decorations made from colored paper and arranging tables in a way that suggested celebration rather than mere sustenance. The women watched these preparations with puzzled curiosity, uncertain what this strange ritual meant or why their captors seemed so invested in it. Captain Sullivan had debated whether to include the prisoners in the Thanksgiving meal. Some of her staff argued that extending such hospitality to enemy captives sent the wrong message, especially when American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific Theater. But Sullivan believed that maintaining basic human decency, even toward enemies, reflected American values better than any propaganda. She ordered the kitchen staff to prepare enough turkey, stuffing, and sweet potatoes for everyone in the compound, prisoners included. On Thanksgiving morning, the German women filed into the mess hall and stopped short at what they saw. The serving line held more food than most of them had seen in years. Whole roasted turkeys, mountains of mashed potatoes, boats of rich gravy, cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels, and pies that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and apples. After years of wartime rationing in Germany, where a single egg had become a luxury and bread was stretched with sawdust, this abundance seemed almost obscene. Ingeborg Richter stood frozen in line, staring at the heaping portions being placed on her tray. She turned to Krista and whispered in German, "This cannot be real. Is this some kind of trick? Why would they give us so much?" Krista had no answer. She accepted her own overflowing plate with trembling hands, suspicion warring with hunger in her mind. Around them, other women reacted with similar confusion, some refusing to take full portions because surely there must be a catch, some hidden punishment waiting. Private Patterson noticed their hesitation and tried to explain through gestures and simple words that this was normal, that everyone ate like this on Thanksgiving, that it was about gratitude and plenty. But his explanations only deepened their bewilderment. How could a country at war afford to feed even its prisoners so extravagantly? What kind of nation possessed such wealth that it could be generous even to its enemies? The meal itself became an education in American excess and openness. The guards ate alongside the prisoners, not at separate tables, but interspersed throughout the hall. They laughed loudly, told stories, and offered seconds and thirds without hesitation. Corporal Michael O'Brien demonstrated how to eat cranberry sauce with turkey, making exaggerated faces of pleasure that drew reluctant smiles from some of the younger German women. Sergeant Yamamoto patiently explained the significance of the holiday to anyone who would listen, his broken German mixing with their broken English in a linguistic compromise. For the first time since their arrival, the women saw Americans not as faceless captors, but as individuals with families and traditions of their own. They began to understand that abundance here was not unusual, that this generosity came not from strategy, but from culture. The days following Thanksgiving brought unexpected warmth to the late November weather, and with it came a subtle shift in atmosphere at Camp Edison. The massive holiday meal had accomplished something that orders and regulations could not. It had planted questions in the minds of the German prisoners about who their captors really were. These questions grew more persistent when Private Patterson arrived at the afternoon meal distribution, carrying his care package from home, and made his fateful decision to share the double bubble gum. Krista unwrapped her piece carefully, examining the soft, pink square with scientific curiosity. Around her, other women were doing the same, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion. The sweet smell was pleasant enough, and when she placed it in her mouth, the initial burst of flavor was delightful. But then the strange texture became apparent. It did not dissolve like candy. It remained stubbornly solid, resisting her attempts to break it down with her teeth. Edeltraud Lang's reaction was more dramatic. She bit down hard, expecting the substance to crumble or melt, and instead found herself with a mouth full of something rubbery that she could not swallow. Her eyes went wide with panic. She tried to force it down her throat, gagging slightly, her face flushing red with the effort and embarrassment. Beside her, Lieselotte Zimmermann was having a similar crisis, chewing frantically and looking around in distress as if she had been poisoned. Private Patterson noticed the commotion and suddenly understood what was happening. These women had never encountered chewing gum before. They thought he had given them some bizarre American candy that had gone terribly wrong. He rushed over, his hands raised in a calming gesture, and demonstrated with exaggerated movements what they were supposed to do. He mimed chewing slowly, opening his mouth to show the gum, then made a popping motion with his cheeks. The realization of their mistake hit the women at different speeds. Ingeborg was the first to laugh, a sound that surprised everyone, including herself. She had been so serious since her capture, so determined to maintain her dignity, but the absurdity of the situation overwhelmed her defenses. Here they all were, dozens of German prisoners struggling with American chewing gum like children encountering their first exotic fruit. The laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep, uncontrollable, and genuine. Her laughter proved contagious. Adelheid Kaufmann began to giggle despite herself, then Traud, then even Christa, who had worked so hard to maintain her leadership through stern composure. Soon the entire mess hall filled with the sound of women laughing at themselves, at the ridiculous misunderstanding, at the strangeness of finding humor in captivity. The American guards joined in, not laughing at the prisoners, but with them, sharing in the moment of absurdity. Jean demonstrated how to blow bubbles, producing a large pink sphere that popped across his face and brought fresh waves of laughter. The gum incident became a turning point that no one had anticipated. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Camp Edison transformed in small but unmistakable ways. The wall of silence that had defined the first month began to develop cracks, and through those cracks flowed the first tentative exchanges between former enemies. The German women still maintained their dignity and reserve, but the absolute refusal to engage had softened into something more like cautious curiosity. Christa found herself thinking about the laughter in the mess hall, how natural it had felt after weeks of rigid control. She had spent so much energy maintaining distance, protecting herself and the other women from vulnerability, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be human in the presence of others. The Americans had not mocked them for their ignorance about chewing gum. Instead, they had shared in the humor, had made it a moment of connection rather than humiliation. Private Patterson became emboldened by the success of his gum distribution. He began bringing small things from his care packages to share, hard candies that actually were meant to be swallowed, comic books with colorful illustrations that needed no translation, and eventually a harmonica that he played badly but enthusiastically during evening recreation time. His clumsy renditions of American folk songs drew smiles and, occasionally, requests for German melodies that he attempted to learn by ear. Sergeant Yamamoto noticed the shift and decided to build on it. He started informal English lessons during the afternoon recreation periods, using a chalkboard brought from storage and teaching basic phrases through repetition and gesture. To his surprise, several women volunteered to participate. Christa was among the first, her quick mind absorbing vocabulary with impressive speed. She had studied English in school before the war, but now she had motivation beyond academic achievement. Understanding the language of her captors meant understanding their intentions, their character, their unexpected capacity for kindness. The lessons became social events rather than purely educational exercises. Ingeborg taught the Americans German words in return, laughing at their clumsy pronunciation. Corporal O'Brien proved particularly terrible at German, his Irish accent mangling even simple words like danka into sounds that bore no resemblance to the original. His earnest attempts became a source of gentle teasing that he accepted with good humor, understanding that being mocked affectionately was a sign of acceptance. Dr. Preston, the camp physician, noticed that more women were coming to sick call with minor ailments that seemed designed more to practice English conversation than to receive medical treatment. Traud, whose health had improved with Jean's blankets and tea, now appeared regularly to ask questions about American customs, using her persistent cough as a convenient excuse. The doctor played along, understanding that these visits served a healing purpose beyond the physical. Evening gatherings in the recreation yard became multilingual affairs, where German and English mixed freely. December brought the first snow to Camp Edison, transforming the stark military compound into something that reminded the German women of home. The sight of snowflakes drifting past the barracks windows stirred memories of Christmas markets in Dusseldorf and Hanover, of warm kitchens filled with the scent of Lebkuchen and Stollen, of family gatherings that now seemed impossibly distant. The approaching holiday deepened their homesickness, even as it presented Captain Sullivan with a difficult decision about how to handle this emotionally charged time. Sullivan had watched the gradual thawing of relations between her staff and the prisoners with cautious optimism. The gum incident and subsequent interactions had created genuine rapport, But Christmas threatened to undermine that progress by reminding everyone of separation and loss. She consulted with her senior staff about whether to acknowledge the holiday at all, weighing the risk of deepening the women's depression against the possibility that shared celebration might further bridge the divide. In the end, she decided to allow modest decorations and a special meal, but she made it clear that participation was entirely voluntary. She expected perhaps a third of the prisoners to engage. What happened instead surprised her completely. Krista approached her office 3 days before Christmas with a formal request delivered in carefully practiced English. "Captain Sullivan, the women would like permission to prepare something for the holiday. We wish to contribute, not just receive." The request touched Sullivan deeply. These women, who had arrived expecting cruelty and had instead found unexpected decency, now wanted to give back. She granted permission for them to use craft supplies and kitchen access under supervision. What the prisoners created over the next 2 days demonstrated both their resourcefulness and their genuine desire to participate in something larger than their own circumstances. Using scraps of colored paper, thread, and whatever materials they could gather, the women crafted decorations that reflected both German and American traditions. Ingeborg, whose steady hands had served her well as a nurse's aide, created intricate paper snowflakes that soon adorned every window in the compound. Adelheid organized a group to make garlands from strips of red and green paper, teaching the younger women techniques she remembered from her childhood. Lotta, the supply coordinator, proved surprisingly artistic, drawing Christmas scenes that were posted throughout the mess hall. But the most ambitious project came from Krista herself. She proposed that the prisoners prepare a musical performance for Christmas Eve, combining German carols with American songs they had been learning. The idea was bold, requiring the women to make themselves vulnerable before their captors in a way that went beyond simple cooperation. It meant sharing something precious from their culture, something that carried memories of better times and lost innocence. Captain Sullivan agreed to the performance and arranged for the mess hall to be configured as a makeshift concert space. Word spread through the compound, and by Christmas Eve, every American staff member who could attend had found a seat. The German women stood before them wearing their best attempts at presentable clothing, their faces reflecting nervousness and determination in equal measure. Krista stepped forward as their spokesperson, her English now confident enough for this moment. January 1945 arrived with bitter cold and the resumption of mail distribution that had been suspended during the holiday season. For the American staff, the arrival of letters from home brought joy and connection to families thousands of miles away. For the German prisoners, the mail call became an exercise in hope and heartbreak that exposed the true cost of their captivity and the uncertainty of their futures. The International Red Cross had established procedures for prisoner correspondence, allowing limited letter exchanges between captives and their families in Germany. Each woman had been permitted to write home shortly after arrival, informing their loved ones of their capture and current location. Now, after 2 months, responses should have begun arriving. Captain Sullivan watched as Sergeant Yamamoto conducted the first mail distribution of the new year, calling names and handing out precious envelopes to the lucky few. Out of 53 women, only 7 received letters that day. The others stood in formation, their faces carefully neutral as they watched their fortunate companions accept their mail with trembling hands. The disappointment was palpable, though most maintained their composure until they returned to the barracks. Krista was among those who received nothing, and the absence felt like a physical blow. She had written to her parents in Dusseldorf, to her younger brother Ernst, who was serving somewhere on the Eastern Front, to anyone who might still be alive and able to respond. Ingeborg did receive a letter, but when she opened it in the privacy of the barracks, she discovered news that made her wish she had received nothing at all. Her mother wrote in shaking handwriting that their home in Hanover had been destroyed in a bombing raid the previous November. Her father and younger sister had been killed instantly. Her mother was now living with relatives in the countryside, subsisting on limited rations and charity. The letter ended with a question that cut deeper than any description of loss. "When are you coming home? We need you here." Ing sat on her bunk holding the letter, her face frozen in an expression that went beyond grief into something like complete devastation. The other women gathered around her silently, understanding without words what kind of news she must have received. Trauda, the youngest, began to cry not for Inga's loss specifically, but for the larger truth it represented. They were all waiting for letters that might never come, news about families who might already be dead, confirmation of losses they could not yet name. The lucky 7 who received mail discovered that good news was relative. Adelheid learned that her husband, a soldier on the Western Front, was missing and presumed captured or dead. Lotta's letter brought word that her hometown of Karlsruhe had been largely destroyed, though her elderly parents had survived. Each piece of correspondence carried the weight of a Germany being systematically reduced to rubble, of families scattered or eliminated, of a homeland that bore little resemblance to the country they remembered. That evening, Private Patterson found Krista sitting alone in the recreation yard despite the freezing temperature, staring at nothing. February brought news that would shatter whatever remained of the German prisoners' understanding of what they had served. The American newspapers began publishing photographs and first-hand accounts from liberated concentration camps, images so disturbing that Captain Sullivan initially debated whether to allow the prisoners access to them. In the end, she decided that these women deserved to know the truth about what had been done in their country's name, even if that truth proved devastating. The camp library, a small room with donated books and week-old newspapers, became the site of a reckoning that would change everything. Sullivan placed the newspapers on the reading table without commentary, allowing the prisoners to discover them in their own time. Krista was the first to enter the library that afternoon, seeking distraction from the continued absence of letters from home. She picked up the New York Times and began reading casually, then stopped as if she had been struck physically. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors with hollowed faces and vacant eyes staring at the camera, guard towers and barbed wire surrounding facilities that bore no resemblance to prisoner-of-war camps like Edison. The captions used words that Krista had to look up in the English-German dictionary: extermination, systematic murder, industrial-scale killing. The Allied forces had liberated a place called Bergen-Belsen, and what they found there defied comprehension. Krista's hands began to tremble so violently that she nearly dropped the newspaper. She forced herself to keep reading, to look at every photograph, to absorb every horrible detail. The article described not just one camp, but an entire system of camps scattered across Germany and occupied territories. Places with names she had never heard: Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Places where millions of people, Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, and others deemed undesirable by the Reich, had been systematically murdered. Ingeborg found her there an hour later, still sitting at the table, newspapers spread before her like evidence at a trial. "Inga," Krista whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "Did you know? Did any of us know this was happening?" Ingeborg picked up one of the newspapers and began reading, her face going pale as she absorbed the contents. Other women began filtering into the library, drawn by some unspoken sense that something important was happening here. The photographs circulated through the group in horrified silence. These were not propaganda images designed to demonize Germany. These were documentary photographs taken by Allied soldiers, corroborated by survivors, verified by journalists from neutral countries. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This had happened. This was real. This was what the Reich had been doing while they served as radio operators and nurses and administrative clerks, believing they were defending their homeland. Adelheid broke the silence with a question that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. What have we been part of? We thought we were serving Germany, serving something honorable. The days following the photograph discovery brought a crisis of identity that went beyond simple shock or horror. The German women at Camp Edison found themselves confronting a fundamental question that had no comfortable answer. Who were they really, if the cause they had served was built on such monstrous foundations? The realization that they had been complicit, however unknowingly, in a system capable of such evil shook the very core of their understanding of themselves and their homeland. Krista stopped eating for 3 days, her appetite destroyed by images she could not unsee. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her service to the Reich through a new and terrible lens. She had processed intelligence reports, had helped coordinate communications that enabled military operations, had performed her duties with pride and efficiency. What had those reports been used for? Which operations had she facilitated? How many deaths could be traced, however indirectly, to her competent service? The barracks became a place of whispered anguish and angry denials that gradually gave way to something worse: acceptance. Some women insisted the photographs must be propaganda, that the Allies were fabricating evidence to justify their invasion of Germany. But as more newspapers arrived, as more details emerged, as the consistency and scale of the evidence mounted, even the most stubborn denials began to crumble. This was not fabrication. This was documentation of reality. Ingeborg spent hours in the library reading everything she could find about the camps, as if understanding the full scope of the horror might somehow make it more bearable. It did not. Each new article brought fresh revelations that deepened her shame. She learned about medical experiments conducted on prisoners, about children separated from parents and murdered, about the industrial efficiency with which human beings had been reduced to ash and numbers. She read survivor testimonies that described unspeakable cruelty carried out by ordinary Germans, people who might have been her neighbors or classmates. The youngest prisoners struggled most visibly with the revelations. Traude, only 19 and still carrying some of the idealism of youth, retreated into near catatonic silence. She had joined the auxiliary service believing the propaganda about defending the fatherland from existential threats, about serving a noble cause against overwhelming enemies. Now she understood that she had been a cog in a machine designed for genocide. The weight of that knowledge seemed to physically diminish her, making her appear even younger and more fragile. Captain Sullivan watched the German women grapple with their collective guilt and found herself in unfamiliar emotional territory. Part of her wanted to let them suffer, to force them to fully confront the consequences of their nation's actions. But another part, the part that had come to know these women as individuals over the past months, recognized that their anguish was genuine. They had not known. Their ignorance did not absolve them, but it did complicate the question of responsibility. Dr. Preston became concerned about the mental health crisis unfolding in the barracks. Several women showed signs of severe depression. Adelheid had stopped speaking entirely. Lotta had begun compulsively washing her hands until they bled, as if trying to scrub away invisible stains. March brought the first signs of spring to Oklahoma and, unexpectedly, the first signs of healing among the German prisoners. The path forward came not from forgetting what they had learned, but from a collective decision to do something meaningful with their remaining time in captivity. If they could not undo the past, perhaps they could at least prove that they were capable of becoming something better than what they had unknowingly served. The transformation began with Krista, who emerged from her depression with a new intensity of purpose. She approached Captain Sullivan with a proposal delivered in English that had become nearly fluent through months of practice. "Captain, we would like to work, not the minimal duties required by regulations, but real work. We want to contribute, to be useful, to prove that we can be more than what Germany made us." Sullivan was initially skeptical, wondering if this was simply a psychological coping mechanism or an attempt to curry favor before repatriation. But as she listened to Krista explain the reasoning behind the request, she began to understand something deeper. These women needed to reconstruct their identities through action, to demonstrate to themselves and others that they were capable of serving something worthy rather than monstrous. Denying them that opportunity would be its own form of cruelty. The captain established a volunteer work program that went far beyond typical prisoner duties. The women could choose areas where they wanted to contribute based on their skills and interests. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, nearly every prisoner had signed up for additional duties that transformed the daily operation of Camp Edison in remarkable ways. Ingeborg requested assignment to the medical facility, where Dr. Preston initially received her with reservation. He had lost colleagues to German military actions and was not certain he could work alongside a former enemy auxiliary member. But Inge's careful attention to detail, her gentle manner with patients, and her obvious dedication gradually won him over. She had a natural gift for nursing that went beyond technical skill into genuine empathy. Within weeks, she had become indispensable to the camp's medical operations. Adelheid revolutionized the administrative systems, applying her organizational talents to streamline record-keeping and supply management. She created filing systems that made information retrieval exponentially more efficient and developed inventory tracking methods that reduced waste and improved resource allocation. Her work was so effective that other camps began requesting copies of her systems for implementation in their own facilities. Lotta discovered an unexpected aptitude for mechanical repairs. She had worked in supply coordination during the war, which required understanding of equipment maintenance. Now she applied that knowledge to fixing everything from kitchen appliances to vehicle engines. Sergeant Yamamoto, himself mechanically inclined, began teaching her advanced repair techniques. He found her to be a quick study who approached each problem with methodical precision. Traude, the youngest, found her calling in translation and education. She began teaching German to American staff members who were interested in learning the language, and her youth and enthusiasm made her an engaging instructor. The role gave her confidence and purpose that helped lift her from the depression that had consumed her after the photograph revelations. May 8, 1945 arrived with church bells ringing across America and celebrations erupting in cities from coast to coast. Victory in Europe Day marked the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, the end of the war that had consumed the continent for 6 devastating years. In prisoner of war camps throughout the United States, German soldiers prepared for eventual repatriation to their defeated homeland. But at Camp Edison, the announcement brought not relief, but a complicated mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. Captain Sullivan gathered all 53 women in the mess hall for the official announcement, her face reflecting the solemnity of the moment. "The war in Europe is over," she told them in clear English, while Krista translated into German for those who still struggled with the language. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. You will eventually be repatriated to your homeland under the terms of the Geneva Convention." The women received this news in silence, their faces showing none of the joy that filled American streets and homes. For them, victory meant defeat, celebration meant devastation, and the promise of freedom meant return to a country that no longer existed in any form they recognized. The Germany they had left was gone, replaced by something broken and occupied, divided among victorious powers, stripped of the illusions that had defined their understanding of national identity. In the days following the announcement, conversations among the prisoners took on a new urgency and desperation. What did repatriation actually mean for them? Reports from Germany painted pictures of total devastation. Major cities lay in ruins, their populations scattered or dead. The occupation zones were struggling with food shortages, disease outbreaks, and the massive logistical challenges of managing millions of displaced persons. Infrastructure had been destroyed, governance structures had collapsed, and the social fabric that held communities together had been shredded by years of war and the revelations about Nazi atrocities. Many of the women still had no confirmed information about their families. Despite months of trying through Red Cross channels, letters remained unanswered. Inquiries disappeared into bureaucratic voids, and the silence from home grew more ominous with each passing week. Krista had heard nothing from her parents or brother in Dusseldorf. Ingeborg knew her mother had survived, but had received no letters since the one informing her of her father and sister's deaths. Traude had no information at all about anyone in her family in Essen. The uncertainty extended beyond family connections to more fundamental questions about survival and identity. What would they return to? Where would they live in cities that no longer existed? How would they support themselves in an economy that had been obliterated? Would they be welcomed by other Germans, or would they be viewed with suspicion as failures who had allowed themselves to be captured? Would they face punishment for their service to the Reich, even though they had been following orders and had been unaware of the full scope of Nazi crimes? But perhaps the most difficult question was one that several women began voicing in private conversations. Did they even want to return? The question that had been whispered in late-night conversations finally emerged into daylight on May 15th, when Krista requested a private meeting with Captain Sullivan. The captain expected a routine inquiry about repatriation procedures or family contact efforts. What she received instead was a request so unprecedented that she had no frame of reference for how to respond to it. "Captain Sullivan," Krista began in her now fluent English, her hands clasped tightly to control their trembling. "I am speaking for myself and several other women. We have discussed this at length, and we understand it is unusual, but we must ask, is there any possibility that some of us could delay our repatriation, that we could remain here longer, or perhaps find some way to stay in America?" Sullivan sat back in her chair, momentarily speechless. In all her military experience, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to extend their captivity rather than accept freedom. The implications were staggering on multiple levels: legal, diplomatic, and profoundly human. She asked Krista to explain her reasoning, and what followed was an outpouring that revealed months of internal struggle and careful deliberation. Krista explained that 14 women had been meeting to discuss their futures and had reached a painful consensus. The Germany they had served no longer existed, and the Germany that was emerging from defeat was a place they did not recognize. More importantly, they had found something at Camp Edison that they feared losing: dignity, purpose, and the possibility of redemption through meaningful contribution. Here they were treated as human beings capable of change. Here they had discovered talents and built relationships that gave their lives meaning beyond survival. "We know what we are asking is extraordinary," Krista continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We are not trying to escape responsibility for our nation's actions, but returning to Germany right now means returning to nothing. No homes, no families we can locate, no opportunities except to struggle in ruins. Here we have work that matters. We have learned what it means to serve something worthy rather than monstrous." Captain Sullivan pressed her for specifics. Which women were involved in this request? What exactly were they proposing? Krista provided names: herself, Ingeborg, Adelheid, Traude, Lotta, and 9 others. They understood they could not remain prisoners indefinitely, but they hoped for some alternative status that would allow them to continue their work and their integration into American society. They were willing to accept any conditions, any restrictions, any requirements that would make this possible. The captain explained that this was far beyond her authority to grant. Such a decision would need to come from the War Department in Washington, possibly from even higher levels of government. It would require navigating complex legal frameworks designed for repatriation, not for voluntary extended residence. It would likely generate controversy and resistance from Americans who saw no reason to show special consideration to former enemy nationals. But despite these obstacles, Sullivan found herself moved by the request. She had watched these women transform over 6 months from rigid defensive captives into engaged, productive members of the camp community. News of the German prisoners' unprecedented request leaked beyond Camp Edison within days, and the reaction from surrounding Oklahoma communities ranged from sympathetic support to angry opposition. Local newspapers picked up the story with headlines that framed the situation in starkly different terms depending on their editorial perspectives. The Tulsa Tribune ran with "Nazi prisoners refuse freedom," while the Oklahoma City Times chose "Captured women seek new start in America." The debate quickly transcended the specific case to become a referendum on forgiveness, justice, and American identity. Mrs. Ruth Blackwell, a school teacher from nearby Edmond who had been visiting Camp Edison as part of a church outreach program, became the prisoners' most vocal civilian advocate. She had spent months getting to know the women, particularly Krista, whose intelligence and genuine remorse had impressed her deeply. Ruth organized a delegation of local residents who had interacted with the prisoners to meet with camp officials and draft a letter of support to send to Washington. "These women are not the same people who arrived here 6 months ago," Ruth argued at a community meeting that drew over 200 attendees. "They have shown us what redemption looks like when people are given genuine opportunities to change. They have contributed meaningfully to our community through their work. They deserve consideration for what they have become, not just judgment for what their country did." But opposition was equally passionate and well-organized. Veterans groups issued statements questioning why enemy nationals should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific Theater. Harold Jensen, who had lost a son at Normandy, spoke eloquently about his concerns at the same community meeting. "My boy died fighting the Nazis," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "How can we reward the people who served that evil regime by letting them stay here? What message does that send about justice and accountability?" The debate reached beyond local communities as national newspapers picked up the story. Editorial pages across the country became battlegrounds for competing visions of American values. Some argued that showing mercy to former enemies demonstrated American moral superiority and would aid in post-war reconciliation. Others insisted that justice demanded these women face the consequences of their nation's actions by returning to rebuild the country they had helped destroy. Religious communities were similarly divided. Some clergy saw the situation as an opportunity to demonstrate Christian forgiveness and redemption. Father Johannes Müller, a German-American priest from Oklahoma City, visited Camp Edison to speak with the women and became convinced of their sincerity. He began lobbying his congregation and fellow clergy to support their request, framing it as a test of whether Americans truly believed in the possibility of human transformation. Other religious leaders took the opposite view, arguing that mercy without justice was meaningless, that these women needed to return to Germany to participate in rebuilding and reconciliation there, rather than escaping to comfort in America. Rabbi Samuel Cohen, whose relatives had died in the camps, delivered a sermon that acknowledged the complexity while ultimately opposing the request. Captain Sullivan's urgent telegram to Washington received a response that was characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent the repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately to Germany. However, given the unprecedented circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status under existing refugee protocols. The decision transformed the women's legal status but solved nothing about their practical futures. They would no longer be prisoners of war, which meant they would no longer be guaranteed housing, food, and protection at Camp Edison. They would need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for them, secure employment that would support them independently, and locate communities willing to accept former enemy nationals as residents. The path forward was far more uncertain and challenging than simple imprisonment had ever been. Sullivan gathered the 53 women to explain their options with compassionate clarity. She emphasized that no choice was wrong, that each woman needed to make the decision that felt right for her own circumstances and conscience. Some would choose repatriation despite the devastation waiting in Germany because duty and family ties pulled them homeward. Others would choose to stay despite the uncertainty because they had found something in America worth fighting for. The announcement divided the group in ways that transcended simple counting. Of the 14 who had originally requested to stay, 5 reconsidered when faced with the reality of losing institutional support. The uncertainty proved too daunting, the practical challenges too overwhelming. They decided to return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage and the lessons they had learned about reconciliation and human dignity. But 9 women, led by Krista and Ingeborg, chose to accept the challenge of building entirely new lives in America. They understood the risks and the difficulties ahead. They knew they would face suspicion and hostility from some Americans who would never see past their German origins. They recognized that starting over with nothing in a foreign country required courage that might exceed what returning home demanded. The women who chose repatriation made their decision with equal thoughtfulness and dignity. They were not fleeing from hard truths or choosing the easier path. Many felt called to return precisely because Germany was broken and needed people willing to rebuild it with new values and understanding. They wanted to carry back what they had learned about forgiveness and cooperation, to become ambassadors of the reconciliation they had experienced in captivity. Adelheid, who had lost her husband and transformed the camp's administrative systems, chose to return. She felt obligated to search for any surviving family members and to contribute her organizational skills to reconstruction efforts. Lotta, despite her mechanical talents and the opportunities Dr. Preston had arranged for further training, also chose repatriation. Her elderly parents were alive and needed her. The conversations among the women during this decision period were marked by remarkable absence of judgment. Those staying did not view those returning as cowards or fools. Those returning did not see those staying as traitors or opportunists. June 20th, 1945 arrived with clear skies and temperatures that promised a scorching Oklahoma summer. The day marked the official repatriation of 44 German women from Camp Edison. But the atmosphere bore little resemblance to typical prisoner processing. Instead of tense formality between captors and defeated enemies, the scene resembled a community farewell gathering filled with complicated emotions that transcended simple categories of victory and defeat. The women choosing repatriation stood in formation one final time, but their military bearing had softened over 7 months into something more human and less rigid. They carried with them small bags containing letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at camp, and modest gifts that guards and staff had given them during emotional private goodbyes. More importantly, they carried transformed understandings of what America represented and what they themselves were capable of becoming. Captain Sullivan addressed the departing women with words she had rehearsed, but still struggled to deliver without emotion. "You came here as our enemies," she told them, her voice steady but warm. "You leave as something none of us expected when you arrived, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest times." Krista stood to respond on behalf of all the women, both those leaving and those staying. Her English had become so fluent that translation was unnecessary, though she paused frequently to control her emotions. "Captain Sullivan, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and the evil we served without understanding its true nature. The women remaining watched their friends board transport trucks that would take them to processing centers, then to ships bound for Europe. Tears flowed freely on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but they were journeys chosen rather than simply endured. The difference mattered more than anyone outside that moment could fully understand. For the 9 women staying, the transition from prisoners to immigrants began immediately and proved even more challenging than anticipated. Housing had to be secured, employment arranged, sponsorships formalized through mountains of paperwork that tested everyone's patience. But the support they received from unexpected quarters made the impossible merely difficult. The Henderson family, whom Mrs. Ruth Blackwell had recruited, offered to sponsor Krista. They provided a small room in their home and helped her secure employment as a translator for the State Department's office in Oklahoma City. Her language skills and unique perspective made her invaluable in processing the thousands of displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Dr. Preston arranged for Ingeborg to continue her medical training at Oklahoma General Hospital under his supervision. He had watched her natural gifts develop over months and believed strongly that her talents should not be wasted. She enrolled in nursing certification programs while working as his assistant, her dedication and gentle manner with patients earning respect from staff who gradually forgot to see her as a former enemy. 25 years after that unprecedented day when German women prisoners asked to remain in American captivity, Krista Lindemann Henderson stood before a gathering at the United Nations in New York. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the power of individual transformation to overcome historical hatred. Now an American citizen with 2 grown children, she carried with her a small leather satchel, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived. At Camp Edison in November 1944. Her speech that day would be remembered as one of the most moving testimonies ever given at the UN about the possibility of peace between former enemies. She spoke about the morning when Captain Sullivan announced their freedom to return to Germany and how that announcement had forced them to confront the most important question of their lives. What did home truly mean? We discovered, she told the international audience, that home is not just where you come from. It is where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. We found that forgiveness is not something given to you. It is something you earn through actions and commitment to becoming better than you were before. But Krista also spoke about something smaller and more specific. A moment involving double bubble gum that had changed everything. She described how Private Eugene Patterson had shared his care package, how the German women had mistaken chewing gum for candy, how their confusion had dissolved into genuine laughter that broke down walls no official policy could have penetrated. That moment taught us something profound, she explained. We learned that connection between enemies often begins not with grand gestures, but with small acts of humanity. A young farm boy sharing gum, a blanket given to a sick prisoner, a meal prepared with generosity rather than calculation. These tiny moments accumulated into transformation that none of us could have imagined. Krista reached into her satchel and pulled out something that drew surprised murmurs from the audience, a vintage pack of double bubble gum that she had saved for 25 years. Gene Patterson, now a successful farmer in Oklahoma and still her friend, had given it to her on her first day as a free immigrant. She had kept it as a reminder of how misunderstanding can become understanding, how enemies can become friends, how sweetness can emerge from bitterness. The story of the German women who begged to stay had become more than historical curiosity. It had become a symbol of America's capacity for redemption and renewal, proof that even in the darkest times, people could choose to see past hatred, to recognize humanity in their enemies. Ingeborg, now Dr. Ingeborg Richter, had become chief of nursing at Oklahoma General Hospital. Trauda had married an American soldier and raised 4 children who knew both German and American heritage. Each woman who stayed had built a life that honored the second chance they had been given. Those who returned to Germany had played equally crucial roles in Reconstruction, carrying stories of American kindness that helped convince other Germans that former enemies could become trusted partners in building better futures.